Good evening and Happy New Year. I am Cindy Prizio, Executive Director of One Standard of Justice. This is a great night thanks to our awesome panel and all of you. We have 37 states represented, several countries, 37 plus the District of Columbia. And I'm going to shout out to Colorado, Michigan, Illinois, California, and Nevada is coming up around what would that be? The fifth spot in terms of representation here. The format for tonight is that we're going to begin with Lara Bazelon's short presentation, viewing victims' rights through a restorative lens in the Me Too era. And then we'll be followed by Alissa, Nuri, and Seema. I then expect a rather robust Q&A. In all our communications tonight, I just need to remind everybody to please share our values: dignity, respect, compassion, and empathy. And kindness matters. I need to mention our honored partners: Restorative Justice on the Rise, Molly Leach; Ampersands, Dr. Alissa Ackerman's and Alexa Sardina's company, which includes the training of RJ facilitators for sexual harm;
Noemi Soto, BG2G.
Friends of Restorative Justice, Washtenaw County, Michigan. You have been such a great help to me. And the work we've been doing together has been grand. And our newest company, and it's modeled after Friends of Restorative Justice, or Forge, Washtenaw County, is Forge of Connecticut. And I think you saw on the slide, we're starting grassroots organizing right now. And I hope many of you will sign up to join us. And then lastly, the National Association for Rational Sexual Offense Laws, or NARSAW. One Standard of Justice, as you may know, is the Connecticut state affiliate of NARSAW. Tonight concludes OSJ's webinar series until late summer, when we will return starting with the new series on child pornography, also known as child sexual exploitation material, consensual relationships between teenagers and young adults, and the laws that govern. And of course, we'll take a bigger dive into restorative justice. Right now, I'd like to invite my guest panelists to come back 1 year from now. OSJ delivered 3 other restorative justice conferences in 2021. Public health professional and academic Mary Koss and attorney Quince Hopkins, who ran Arizona's Restore program until federal funding dried up. Marley Liss's story, which is her journey to meaningful justice for sexual harm. And finally, Seema Gajwani, who spoke about successfully practicing RJ for serious violent offenses out of the Office of the AG in District of Columbia. To access them and others, go to onestandardofjustice.org/webinars. Tonight's conversation may trigger strong reactions for some of us. OSJ and our panel wants to create a safe space for all of us. Please put self-care first and know you are not alone. If you need to, step outside the meeting temporarily, have a glass of water and breathe. Having said that, we want to encourage all questions, no matter how complex and difficult to ask, be asked by you. I want to quickly share the story. 10 years ago, I heard a young woman speak about how, as a young child, her grandfather molested her. The room fell silent with a group sigh. She immediately said, no, everything's okay. We'll all be sitting down for Thanksgiving dinner in a couple of weeks. I had no idea how meaningful this story would become to me in my life. Connecticut's Danielle Coooper has returned for tonight, and we are so happy she did. finally, I need to mention Senator Winfield. Thank you for your endorsement to get us to this moment in time and your encouragement on a subject that remains mostly closeted or cloaked in secrets. So let's take it out tonight and start normalizing the conversation on sexual violence in the name of prevention, healing, and restoration for all impacted by sexual harm. Senator Winfield.
Thank you, Cindy. Good evening to all who are viewing this evening. I want to thank Cindy and One Standard of Justice for having me co-sponsor the series that we've done. It has been, I think, very impactful, and I think it's opened people's eyes to some things that they just couldn't have possibly had their eyes open to without One Standard of Justice's efforts. We were talking a little bit before we went live, and I was talking about, from my perspective, what's important about this. And I think this work that we're doing, I think what's important is that it gives people opportunity to pause and reassess the things they think they've always known. I think people in a policy space, at least here in Connecticut, have been operating in all sincerity, thinking that as we move forward, we are doing good things for people who have been on the wrong side of all kinds of crimes, particularly some of the things that we will be talking about this evening. And there was a conversation going on about whether or not restorative practices take into account the people who are victims and what it does for those people. And it was interesting to me because I wonder, if we don't have restorative practices, what about people who need those practices? What about people who need something that the criminal justice system does not offer them? And I can tell you that almost 40 years ago, I was a person who experienced sexual harm. And for me, even as I think about it now, there are parts of that experience that are as present as they were in that moment, as real, including sights and smells and some of the things that happen. And while that person never found themselves inside of the system, what I needed was healing. What I needed was to understand some things about my experience. What I needed was not the things that I can get out of the system as it's constructed, because our system is constructed in a very punitive way that is not about my healing. It's about, we punish this individual and we call that good for the victim, but none of that would have been good for me. And so I spent a lot of years figuring out, how do you heal from this? And how do I reckon with some of the things that I have in my mind about the experience itself? And so when Cindy contacted me to be a part of doing this work, I recognized that this work is critical, because I think people as I said, I think people in all real, sincere belief think that they are doing good by the people they call victims, but no system works for everyone. And a system that allows for restorative practices, I think, is important. So I've been proud to co-sponsor this work. I don't think it's all that controversial. If we can't seek answers, then we're not seeking justice. And answers require that we seek understanding. So let me start talking, because I know that we have some powerful, impactful panelists who are going to open up your minds, if you haven't been open, and take us in directions we really need to go to, at least here in Connecticut. And I want to say to you that you are in for a great panel. We have Dr. Danielle Coooper back, who will be moderating, and she's phenomenal in many ways. So Dr. Coooper, it's on you.
Good evening, everyone. And first, let me thank our sponsors. Thank you so much, Senator Winfield, for your vision and your leadership in this work. And thank you so much, Cindy, and to everyone at One Standard of Justice who provides it so that over 175 people are here tonight, indicating that we understand the value of victim-centered justice. We understand that the criminal justice system may have a role, but no system is perfect. And restorative justice provides us a chance to understand, just as Senator Winfield said, what are ways that people are not being properly served? What are ways that people can be harmed less? And so before I get started, let me just bring you greetings on behalf of the University of New Haven, where I serve as an associate professor of criminal justice, and I'm also the director of research at the Youth Justice Institute. In my past 15 years of research, I've focused on a variety of topics, but in the last decade, I've had the privilege of working with researchers that have helped me understand women's voice in the topic of sexual offenses, helped me understand economic impact, and more recently, in 2020, I had the privilege of being trained by a practitioner at the Youth Justice Institute that trained me in part of the IIRP model in restorative practices. And it really showed me how much confusion there is around restorative practices, how widely applicable it is. And so what we have for you all today is a panel. So just take a moment, take a deep breath. If you don't have some pen and paper, consider getting that. If you don't have water or whatever your preferred beverage is, get that, because it's a rare occasion to have such a vast array of experts here on one panel in one night for one discussion. And so without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you, Lara Bazelon.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and welcome everyone. I'm really overwhelmed by this turnout and just the incredible work that folks are obviously doing in the chat and just to be in this panel. I'm a law professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law, and I direct 2 clinics, which is a way of training students how to be lawyers. We have actual clients, and I also study and think a lot about restorative justice. So Cindy, who kindly asked me to participate tonight, also asked me if I would share a PowerPoint of mine that I developed around some of the research, viewing victims' rights through a restorative lens in the Me Too era, Lara Bazelon. So yeah, I mean, sexual violence is often intraracial, not interracial. The vast majority of cases, folks know each other. A lot of sexual assaults are intimate partner violence. And as many of you know, people who are poor, people who are trans, people of color are more likely to be sexually assaulted than people who are white, than white women who are traditionally, I think, centered in this dialogue about sexual violence. And I think often overlooked in the conversation is the fact that there's a big overlap in the Venn diagram between victims and perpetrators. So just a quick slide here. It seems that we're constantly essentializing victims, and that we think about sexual assault victims in the media. Traditionally, they're white, they're attractive, they're often assaulted by a Black stranger or victimized by a kind of serial sexual predator, somebody like Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein, even though statistically that type of victim is rare. But the prototype really does have an outsized impact on the way that media cover sexual violence and also the political and legal responses to it. So we also, in the same way, we essentialize offenders. When people are asked, you know, who's a sexual predator, you'll hear things like Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein or, you know, Brock Turner, the Stanford swimmer whose case got outsized attention a couple of years back. There's also a way in which we criminalize the behavior, particularly of Black men, and we sexualize them. And that is a long, dark history dating all the way back to slavery that lives on today. It lives on in the power of the Willie Horton story, which was the story that was dredged up against Michael Dukakis, basically to paint him as soft on crime. Willie Horton was someone who, on a prison furlough, assaulted a woman and committed a violent crime. And that was used basically to say that, you know, Dukakis was not fit to be president because he wasn't sufficiently tough on crime. They picked Willie Horton on purpose because he essentialized white fear about crime. And then, of course, what we do to Black children, which is we do not treat them like children. I could go on ad infinitum about this, but these are prototypes that are used to drive the carceral narrative. And when you have this intersection between race and rape, you have one of the most incendiary combinations in United States history, the effects of which we're still living with today. We also just don't talk about the majority of women who make up the majority of victims. So just to give you an example, the Central Park jogger case, well known to everybody with a pulse, that was one attack on one day. The same night in Manhattan, another woman who was a Black woman, the mother of a 7-year-old, she was gang raped and stabbed and killed. This is someone who was attacked, in Boston, not in New York, and nobody paid any attention to that case. The same week that the jogger was attacked, 28 other women in New York were raped, but they were all Black and Latina, and so nobody paid any attention to their cases. So this is, again, just a way in which we think about, or in popular culture, sexual violence is essentialized, and many, many people who experience the harm are cut out of the narrative. At the same time, we also do a pretty poor job of holding people accountable for sexual assault. So, what women are often told is, well, you can seek recourse in the criminal justice system. Now, traditionally, until the 1970s, many, many sexual assault victims were not taken seriously. And that was particularly true if they were in some kind of an intimate partner situation. In fact, spousal rape was not even recognized as a crime in most states. And as we all know, many women who did go forward with that process were subjected to invasive cross-examination, in which essentially they were put on trial, not the person who had been accused of harming them. We have reforms now. We have rape shield laws in California and many other states. We have something called Marsy's Law, which is meant to empower victims and keep them informed. Judges have less discretion at sentencing, and the statute of limitations in many states has been expanded so that people can bring forward allegations later in time. And yet, the system isn't actually particularly good at dealing with sexual assault for some of the reasons that I already said. Essentially, what the criminal justice system says, or the criminal legal system says to victims, is there's really one option for you, is that you make this report, and then we process your case through the adversary adjudicatory system. You either have that option or you have no option at all. And I think the problem with that is it sort of assumes that every victim of sexual violence wants the same thing, which is to go through that process. And what they want is what I call the carceral solution, meaning that they want the person who hurt them to go away for the longest possible time under very severe conditions. And I think the problem with this approach is it's very one size fits all. It doesn't take into account the complexity of needs and relationships and what's actually going on in many of the communities where the harm is occurring. And so rather than centering the victim, this approach can often sideline the victim, essentially taking the story away from the victim, carving it up in a way that the criminal legal system can digest. And then in the process of all of that, the person who's been harmed often loses all control, loses the sense of the narrative. And if what they want isn't the carceral solution, they're unlikely to get it. Never mind the fact that, of course, most cases end in plea agreements. And so there isn't a chance to tell your story, even in some kind of an abbreviated form in a courtroom. But that is the carceral promise, which is we're going to find this person, we're going to prosecute him to the maximum extent possible, and that's going to be healing for you. And that is what prosecutors and police have been telling victims for a long time now. And yet, as we know, at least with rape, it's the least reported, it's the least indicted, it's the least convicted felony that isn't a property crime. And that's been true over time, no matter how the laws have changed. And then there's also the fact that the research tends to show that a lengthy sentence isn't necessarily healing to the person who has been harmed. Moreover, I think people who have to go through the criminal legal system as victims and survivors can be re-traumatized by that process. Why is that? Well, because the United States Constitution requires due process. And what that means is that you get a lawyer who's going to advocate for the person who's being accused, and that lawyer's job is to represent that person's interests. And that means subjecting the person bringing the accusation to very extensive cross-examination. And there are people who've been through that process that say that it was re-victimizing and re-traumatizing. Even if someone is convicted, though, they're unlikely to really give the kind of validation that the person is seeking, because of course there's always going to be an appeal. And so the lawyer, and I say this as a criminal defense lawyer, is going to say, admit nothing, deny everything. And that is not very healing when the person who, even when they've been convicted, is still not saying, this is what I did, this is why I did it, this is why it's not going to happen to anyone else. The criminal legal system, as it's set up in the adversarial way, is not designed to deliver that kind of an outcome. And then the statistics are just very daunting, which is to say that from 2010 to 2014, which is the most recent, I think, available federal statistics on sexual harm, the conviction rate was less than 1%. So I think it's really important to just say that I am not saying that we should never have an adjudicatory process. In fact, my belief is that it should be victim-centered, and I think that some victims want that process and they should have it. But what I'm saying is that it's not the process for every victim. And for those who want to tell their stories in their own words, under their own terms, and who want acknowledgement from the offender that they were harmed rather than denial or minimization, and they want the offender held accountable in a very specific way, which is to say, this is what I did, I'm acknowledging the root causes of that, I have insight into my behavior, I'm going to take steps to make sure it never happens to anybody else. If those are the goals, then it may be that the restorative approach is a more healing approach. And then this is just a picture of some women who are at the forefront of a restorative movement, who've all been the victims of sexual violence, rape, and sexual assault. Sujatha Baliga, the MacArthur scholar who was subjected to sexual violence by her father, Stephanie Harrelson, who was raped in college, Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, and Heather Marlowe, who was attacked actually in San Francisco. And these are all people who've suffered incredibly traumatic, violent experiences, sexual assaults, and who don't want the traditional legal system's solution. They were searching for the restorative solution, and they've advocated in their own ways to have that as an alternative. And I think everyone's familiar with the principles of restorative justice, but the focus is really on being heard, being seen, and receiving acknowledgement and some sense of accountability from the person who has perpetrated the harm. You know, I think that this is a controversial thing, that people who are proponents of restorative justice in other areas are very nervous about the idea of it being applied in a setting involving sexual violence. People worry that it's quote unquote soft on crime or letting people off the hook, that it's not going to incapacitate or deter people. A lot of folks are just very skeptical of restorative justice in general, and in particular in cases like these, which are so fraught and bring out so many different emotions. So my feeling about it is that no one should ever be forced into restorative justice. I think anybody who knows anything about RJ knows that that is a doomed to fail approach, but I believe really strongly that people who've been victimized should have a choice. And it's interesting that when you look at some of the data that's out there, much of which is outside of the United States, because we don't really use RJ enough to have a number of sound empirical studies. But when you look at what's out there, both here to the limited degree exists, and then in other countries where it's used more widely, what you see is that if people are offered a choice, do you want restorative justice or do you want the traditional criminal legal system? People will choose restorative justice. And it's interesting, there's this organization, Common Justice in New York. They do not do sexual violence, but they focus almost entirely on very serious violent crimes, stabbings, maimings, shootings. The folks who are victimized choose the restorative approach 90% of the time, and they only have a 6% recidivism rate. And so I think that goes some way towards addressing these concerns that like people are being let off the hook and they're just going to go back and do it again, et cetera. And then, and Cindy referred to this, but Dr. Mary Koss, who's a hero of mine, she had a pioneering project in Pima County, Arizona, unfortunately, until the federal funding dried up. And she's one of the few people in the United States who has done very rigorous empirical studies. And in her program, the people who came through at the end, 90% of them felt like justice had been done in their case. So I just want to conclude by saying, I don't think the current system is working for most victims or recognizes most victims. As I said, I think that too many people are just completely erased from the sexual violence narrative and not honored and not heard and not seen. And that RJ has been shown to work, that it has promise. I'm hopeful that it may encourage more victims to come forward because, of course, as we know, this is an extremely underreported crime. And in part, that's because the people who've been harmed don't want the carceral solution for the person who harmed them. They don't want that because it rips their communities and families apart. But if they knew that they had some other option, maybe they would. And I just think that it makes sense to keep having fora like this, where people share their work, share their stories, share their ideas, so that restorative justice can be more widely understood and practiced. Because I think when it comes to addressing sexual violence, we need more than the current criminal legal system is offering us. And so with that, I just want to say thank you. And I'm going to stop the share and hand it off to Alissa.
Thank you so much, Lara. I second everything that you said in that presentation. It is exactly what I stand by. So my name is Dr. Alissa Ackerman, and I am an associate professor of criminal justice at California State University, Fullerton. And I am also one of the co-founders of Ampersand's Restorative Justice, which is an organization with the mission to build a world restored from sexual harm. So I have studied sexual violence and sexual harm for my entire career, which began in 2004 when I went to graduate school. And I always thought that I would do work, working to end victimization, sexual victimization, by working with survivors. And very quickly, I realized that in order to end victimization, you actually have to work with the people who author the harm. And so that led to a career as a researcher where I studied post-conviction policies for people who have sexually harmed. So I want to build on sort of what Lara was talking about. After somebody is convicted and placed on a registry and forced to notify communities of their whereabouts, that's kind of where my research focused. And so number one, as I said, I want to echo what Lara said. Those laws that we have, pretty much all of the memorial legislation we have regarding sexual violence is written and named after young white children who have been, sexually harmed, raped, and murdered. So the very legislation that we use post-conviction does not reflect the reality of most people who experience sexual harm, especially people of color. These laws are all named after white children. So the research that I did, in the first part of my career focused on these post-conviction policies. And what we found, by and large, was that these policies are completely ineffective at reducing rates of sexual violence. In fact, in a 2012 study that I conducted, I found that they had zero impact. These policies further isolate people. They do not rehabilitate, they do not restore, they pull families apart, and they are not necessarily what people who experience sexual harm want. And it's one of the reasons why, in addition to what Lara talked about, it's one of the reasons why people don't come forward when it's a family member or a friend who has harmed them, because they don't want to see the lifetime consequences for people who are forced to register. So that was kind of the work that I did for the first 15 years of my career. It's important to note that I did all of that work silent about the fact that I myself am a rape survivor. And, I've never really talked about the fact that I was a survivor, but especially in my career, I was afraid that people would think that my work wasn't objective, that somehow a survivor of sexual violence doing work on registries and working with people who had sexually harmed, that I couldn't be objective in that work. And I have been accused of that when I have, stood by students who have been harmed, that I couldn't possibly be professional because of my own lived experience. So in 2014, I decided that I could no longer be silent. I could not do this work. I could not teach these classes and work with students who had experienced harm and those who had perpetrated harm without being honest about the fact that I myself am a rape survivor. So the first person that I disclosed to was Dr. Jill Levinson, who has worked with people who have sexually harmed as a treatment provider. She's a close friend and colleague. And she happens to live in the town that I grew up in. I did not know her when I was growing up, but on one of my trips home to visit, she asked me if I would come speak to the men in her treatment program. But she wanted me to come as Alissa, rape survivor, not Dr. Ackerman, sex crimes expert. So I said, of course, I would do anything for her. And I went and I met the men in her treatment program. So the first night that I was there, I met with 30 men across 2 groups. So each group was about an hour and 15 minutes. And I came in, we sat in circle. And, I talked about my story. I asked questions of the men. Many of them shared their stories and asked questions of me. And it turned out to be one of the most profound moments of healing that I've ever experienced. In fact, that night, there was a man in the group who had served 20 years in prison for a violent rape that was very similar to mine. And he asked if he could give me a hug. And I threw my arms around this man. And it was just this really profound moment for the two of us. After that, I asked Dr. Levinson if she would go with me to the place that I was raped. It was a beach in South Florida. And so she took me out there, and I was able to walk out onto this beach in the dark and recount the whole story. I talked about, the differences between the night that I was raped and the night that we were standing there. It was almost exactly 17 years to the date. And I was able to go out there without the flashbacks. I was able to go out there without the panic and the anxiety that had consumed me, because what I had just done was restorative justice, right? It was vicarious restorative justice. I didn't know any of the men in the treatment program, but being able to sit with them in a way that humanized them for me and in a way that humanized me for them was incredibly, incredibly healing. And I continued going back to those groups every 6 months to continue the rapport building, the connection that I had built with them. And that work then led to working in other treatment programs here in California, in Oregon, back in Florida, working with now over 500 people who have perpetrated acts of sexual harm. And so I do that work. I sort of think of myself as a professional survivor in that work. What that led to was me talking on social media and giving public talks about my work in vicarious restorative justice. And people started reaching out to me asking if I would facilitate cases for them. So, starting out, I did the work pro bono because I said, I'm not trained as a restorative justice facilitator. I have done this work in treatment programs. If you will trust me through the process, I have taught about restorative justice my whole career, but I've not facilitated it. And so I started doing that work and building a practice. And so since 2014, 2015, I have continued facilitating those cases in the community, which led to the start of Ampersand's Restorative Justice. So we are currently in week 11 of a training program for people who are interested in becoming facilitators in cases of sexual harm. There are people in the cohort who are already facilitating cases. It is an amazing, amazing group of people. So we do training, we do direct facilitation, but really what we're most excited about is working with organizations and institutions, district attorneys' offices, faith-based organizations, to build a model for them that's unique to their organizations. And everything that we do is evidence-based. And in addition to being evidence-based, we are listening to the needs of individual communities. Communities and individuals are experts in their own lived experiences. And so what I always say in the training program is, I can train you in the model that I've developed, but you get to take your own flair and you do you in your restorative practice. And what I have found with working with other survivors is that by and large, they find so much more healing in a restorative practice because they get to share their story in their own way. They get to feel safe. They get to direct the process, right? It is a collaborative process. and they get to ask for the things that they need directly to the person who harmed them. And what I have found with working with people who have harmed is that, you know, in particular in vicarious restorative justice, many of the men that I have worked with say they would rather sit in a prison cell than face me, that restorative justice is the hardest thing that they've ever done. I had a client recently say to me, parole is a cakewalk, right? That's nothing. What you're asking me to do, that's hard, because naming specifically what it is that you did and coming to understand why you did it and having to sit face to face with the person that you harmed and offer true amends, active amends, and then agree to these accountability measures that are ongoing. That is not easy to do. And so that is why I continue to do this work. I have found it healing for myself more so than anything else I have ever tried. And I see it in the clients that I work with every single day. So I am sold both as an academic, I am sold as a participant, I am sold as a facilitator. And one of the things that Lara talked about was there really hasn't been a lot of sound evaluation research, right? Mary Koss is really at the forefront of that work. That's one of the other things we're doing at Ampersand. So my co-founder, Dr. Alissa Sardina, and we are evaluation researchers. But when I was participating in processes, I didn't feel that it was right to be participant and researcher. So a lot of what I have from those experiences are anecdotal. But now that we are building these practices and building these models for organizations, we are building in that evaluation research piece so that we can, show proof of concept that this really works, and that across the board, people who participate are far more satisfied with this type of process than with going through a criminal legal process. And so with that, I will turn it over to Nuri.
Hi, I see you. It's really nice to be in community with you, even if it's on Zoom. And I was trying to think of what it is that I want to say, because I feel like Alissa and Lara said so much of what I would have wanted to say. Maybe I'll just introduce myself. I am the child of 2 survivors of sexual harm, and the person that did the sexual harm was in my family. And I'm the child of 2 survivors that didn't want the criminal punishment system involved in what happened. What they wanted was for the harm to stop. I also have done restorative. I went to law school. I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I did death penalty work, and then I very quickly found that people were re-traumatized from everything that I was a part of. And so I wanted to find something that could actually bring healing. And that was what I looked for. And I found restorative justice. And I helped start restorative justice diversion programs, which I think Seema might talk about, all of the incredible diversion work that kind of is happening for young folks in the United States. And I also offered to do restorative justice for sexual harm. And one of the things that I did was doing groups with folks inside who had maybe experienced sexual harm and maybe committed sexual harm. And so I'm going to explain a little bit about that work, but I think I just want to take a step back. And when I was listening to folks, I was thinking of the Judith Herman quote, which is, if one set out by design to devise a system for provoking intrusive post-traumatic symptoms, one could not do better than a court of law, right? This is one of the people that kind of came up with complex PTSD, complex trauma, and understood this. And Judith Herman says that the court process actually re-traumatizes victims, right? And if any of you have worked with survivors that have been through the process, you might have heard the same thing from them. And so what I want to say is that restorative justice can reduce the harm that we're doing to survivors rather than increase the harm. The process can actually reduce the harm. And so there's lots of studies. I don't want to get too into the weeds, but there's a lot of studies that say survivors need something that helps reduce their PTSD or their trauma afterwards is getting to ask the questions they need answered, specifically the question of why me, right? And all the survivors that I've worked with, even when they knew logically that it wasn't their fault, they still had that question of why me? And they still found ways to blame themselves, even though we were saying that this is not your fault. And they knew, like on a psychological, like on a, I guess on a brain level, that it wasn't their fault, but their bodies felt something different. And so getting to sit face to face with someone and ask why me, and to hear that it was never their fault, actually can reduce PTSD symptoms, right? As Lara said, and other people have said, like the criminal punishment system, like there's a Harvard article that came out that says like some places have a recidivism rate up to 75%. So like this system on all fronts, like it's traumatizing survivors. It might have high recidivism rates. Like it's just not meeting people's needs, right? And restorative justice is actually needs focused. It is asking people like, what do you need? It's asking survivors, what is it that you need? And so right now, the work that I do is facilitating restorative processes for people that kind of don't want to engage systems. And many people that come to me are survivors of sexual harm. And I feel like when other people find out about that, sometimes they pathologize survivors and they say like, oh, like what's wrong with them that they want restorative justice? And I think that goes to what Lara is saying, like in every aspect, their choice is being taken away from them, or they're questioned and judged rather than listened to, right? The restorative justice is actually saying like, you actually have wisdom. Let's listen to you and let's get you something that you need. I feel like survivors, like the ones that have come to me, have said like, my family thinks that there's something wrong with me for wanting this, rather than there's something that I actually know about what I need. The criminal legal system says like, here's the process. You have no choice in this process. Like you can come give your victim impact statement. You can, share evidence, but like, we're not going to actually ask you what would meet your needs. And on the flip side, like I've worked with folks who were charged with crimes, who actually wanted to make an apology, who wanted to explain to their survivors, this is why, like this had nothing to do with you. And I want to answer all your questions and I want to give an apology. And their lawyers would tell them like, you cannot do that because that's an admission of guilt. So no part of the system actually allows for truth telling. No part of the system allows for that why me question, right? And restorative justice offers that. Should be always voluntary. But it really, like when I think I'm trying to think of like what would be most useful here, because there are a lot of practitioners. Maybe I'll talk about some of the why. Like when survivors come to me and say that they want restorative justice instead of the criminal punishment system, some of them have been through the system and were severely traumatized and said, I don't ever want to go through that again. Many actually, like I think 99% of people have said, what I want is to get to the root causes of why this person did this so that I can stop, that the harm can stop and we can prevent future harm. And if I'm not able to ask why, I can't get to the root causes. Like if our entire system doesn't ask people why this harm happened, we can't stop future harm. And so what they're asking is like, can we have a process that actually asks why and then gets people whatever it is they need to not do this in the future? And then there's like a whole host of other reasons, but many people say like, this person is in my family. If I report them, I lose my immigration status. If I report them, I lose the person that's the sole breadwinner in my house. If I report them, I go into foster care. And many have said like the statute of limitations, has actually silenced me. Like I tried to do my research to wait until the statute of limitations was over so then I could report, because I actually can't lose my immigration status. I can't lose the sole breadwinner. What I want is accountability, and there's no place in the system that lets me ask for that. And so all of that was kind of a long way of saying like, all that I do is listen to survivors and try to work with them to figure out what it is that they need, and then figure out if those needs can be met. That's like what restorative justice is. And if someone that has done the harm is to participate, like they're there to offer genuine remorse, to be accountable, which means answering all the questions the survivor asks, helping to repair the harm in the way that the survivor is asking, and prevent future harm, like doing all that it is that they need to do so that they don't do this harm again, right? It is always voluntary for survivors at every step. They can be 99% of the way into the process and then decide that they don't want to do it. Like, these are things that the criminal legal system doesn't do. Like, that is what we try to build into restorative justice. And as a facilitator, I know like a lot of people worry about survivor safety. Like, that is our job, is to make sure that the survivors are safe and that the person that does the harm is also safe and is coming ready to be accountable and ready to offer remorse. So I feel like I'm going all over the place. I'm going to talk for like another minute about the work that I've done inside prison, and then I'll pass it to Seema, which is, you know, I got to do work inside with folks that had committed sexual harm and or experienced sexual harm. And I think it feels really important for people to know that these folks were some of the most accountable people I've ever met, more accountable than I am as a human being to the people in my life, more accountable than my friends are when we do harm to each other, that they are doing the groups that I was were a part of basically said, like, yes, you need to be accountable, and to be accountable, you also have to heal. And to heal, you have to understand why you were able to get to this point where you did this harm, right? Why this happened. And so part of the work is reviewing like your whole entire life to understand what led to this. And we always like centered survivors, and we brought survivors in to do like, to share about how they were harmed and have kind of like what Alissa was talking about, do surrogate dialogues where they got to have their questions answered. All of the survivors I brought in said that this was the most accountability they'd ever gotten, that it was the most safe that they felt with a group of men in a long time. And that is because like folks were doing the work to figure out what led to the crime and what led to the harm, but also to heal themselves so they couldn't do it over again, and to always think of their survivors, to always center their needs, even if they can never have a dialogue with them. And so I think I just want to say, like, the system that we're a part of doesn't allow those chances, doesn't allow people to figure out what they need to actually repair harm and to repair themselves so that they don't do harm again. But people, when given a chance, like, there are many people that are doing this, and the survivors that I am supporting have said, like, this is what they want, and they want the people that harm them to have the opportunity to be accountable and to get what they need to be accountable, so that both the survivor can get the answers that they need and feel that the harm will stop, right? And so in restorative justice, we're asking the questions like, what would stop? Why did you do this? And what could stop future harm? So I think I'll stop there and pass it to Seema.
Thank you so much, Nuri. I want to first say thank you to Cindy and Senator Winfield and Dr. Coooper for having me and hosting this, and say that I'm honored to be on a panel with people like Nuri and Dr. Bazelon and Alissa and Dr. Ackerman and the great folks who are here in the audience who are doing this work. So very honored to be here. My name is Seema Gajwani. I work in the Washington, D.C. Office of the Attorney General. We are the prosecutor for all juvenile crime in the District of Columbia. And we also handle a small segment of lower level adult crimes. I run the restorative justice program within the Office of the Attorney General. We've had our program since 2017. We handle almost all juvenile crime, although we have handled some adult cases from the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is our counterpart in DC, our federal prosecutor and our adult prosecutor. I have 7 full-time restorative justice facilitators who work with me in our office alongside prosecutors, almost none of whom are lawyers. They're trained restorative justice facilitators. Since 2017, we've had hundreds of referrals. We've handled over 250 restorative justice conferences, which are the dialogues between the person who's harmed or the victim or complainant and the person who caused the harm. And we currently, we are growing. We are hiring more restorative justice facilitators, more program staff, social worker. And we currently only handle serious violent crime cases. And as Dr. Bazelon mentioned, we speak to victims of violent crime and offer restorative justice as an option for them, and some say no. But many, many more than you would expect, and most victims of violent crime who are offered restorative justice in our office agree to do restorative justice. And we do victim satisfaction surveys using a validated survey instrument that came out of New Zealand 6 months after the practice, after the dialogue itself with the victims of the crime, and have victim satisfaction rates that are consistently in the 90% and more. I thought that what might be valuable today for you all as an audience is to talk about a case that I handled. We haven't handled very many serious sexual assault cases, but we've handled some. And I thought I would tell you the story of the first sexual assault case that I facilitated as a lead facilitator in my office, in part to explain what restorative justice could look like in a system, at a prosecutor's office or outside of a prosecutor's office in the community, and referred through a prosecutor's office in an existing justice system. So we had been doing restorative justice in our office for a few years, maybe a couple of years by the time this case came to us, and it came from the head of our sexual crime, domestic violence unit of prosecutors, and it was one of their most senior prosecutors, and she came to us and said, I would never, ever refer a case like this to restorative justice. It's a rape case, but the victim in this case insists that what she wants is to speak to the person who harmed her. And I've talked to her about the fact that we have this restorative justice program. When I explained it to her, she said, that's exactly what I want to do. So I'm coming to you to see if you'd be willing to take this case. It wasn't an intimate partner domestic violence situation, but it was a rape between people who knew each other. And so we started working with, in this case, a young woman, and the person who harmed her, who was a young man. And the woman had started talking to us and talked to the prosecutor about restorative justice as an option, in part because she was very worried about cross-examination if she went to trial. She was kind of worried about, essentially victim shaming. She had, there were a couple things about her situation. She had known the person who raped her, and they had had a sexual encounter before. And when he came to her house, she didn't tell him to leave. Also, after the sexual assault happened, she didn't report. She left town, and she didn't report for many, many months. And in fact, she texted a little bit with the person who harmed her. And so she was very worried about how that would look in front of a judge or a jury. By the time that this case came to us, both the young people had already turned 18, but the time at which this encounter happened, both of them were under 18. They were 17. And because it was my first sexual assault case, facilitating a sexual assault case, I leaned on somebody who had helped train me and my staff when we first started doing this work, Tariq Masarani, who had been doing restorative justice work in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding areas for a long time, and also was had been doing work with sexual harm cases for some time. And so he coached me. And so I had a co-facilitator working with me, one of my colleagues, Roman, who Nuri knows. He used to work with Nuri. And Roman and I would meet with the young person who caused the harm. We would meet with the woman who was harmed. We met with both sides, dozens of times over several months. First having to go through the young man's lawyer, and then talking to his parents, speaking to all of them together, explaining the process, explaining what would be expected of everybody. And then we would meet individually with the two people. And before and after every meeting, I would call Tarek and he would coach me through, you know, how it went and what to do next time. And so I was really, really well supported in doing the case. One thing that I found really interesting about some of the stuff that I remember really stood out to me about how Tarek talked about the matter was I remember he was in my office and there's like a wall. I probably didn't have art or anything up. And he pointed to the wall and he said, you know, the woman who's been harmed, the level of intensity and trauma of her experience started out here on this chart. And he said, her journey towards healing is going to be this long line where the intensity is going to hopefully go down and she'll go through healing. And he said, the restorative justice conference that you are going to help hold and facilitate, that will be somewhere in the middle. It is not the end of her journey of healing. It is, and I remember he used the words, a milestone or an inflection point in the process of healing. And that was really valuable to me to hear, and also for me to talk to her about, because otherwise there is this expectation that I find with victims of violent crime, not only sexual crime, that something is going to be solved at the Restorative Justice Conference. And that's not always how it feels. It is a very emotionally powerful experience, but it doesn't fix everything. It doesn't solve the problem. And it's helpful to take that pressure off for everyone. And Tarek also said that the experience of the person who caused the harm, their emotional experience, the intensity of it, if this is where the person who was harmed is here, it starts down here and then it will go up to the point where that person has the Restorative Justice Conference. And that is going to be an intense experience for them, and probably the most intense experience in the process or in his experience of harm. And that was also interesting to hear. Another thing that Tarek said that still stands out in my head and informs how, you know, I talk about the work with my colleagues and how we do the work is, he said, to be truly trauma informed, there should be no surprises. And that was important because in the dialogues with the two parties in preparation for the Restorative Justice Conference, there was information that was likely to come out from the young man that was going to be surprising to the woman. And in other restorative justice conferences, that sometimes happens, right? Like past trauma comes out, past experiences on both sides often like kind of bubble up and become known. And that kind of contributes to the emotional intensity of the experience in typically a pretty positive way. And in this situation, one of the things that was going to likely come out was the person who caused the harm, the young man, his previous sexual victimization was likely to come out. And what Tarek suggested is that that should not come out for the first time. She should not learn about that for the first time in this experience. And so, you know, I asked for permission from him, if it was okay to share that and a couple of other issues with her. And I did, and it was so important that we did, because she, you know, kind of broke down, had an emotional experience, you know, felt a bunch of different emotions and could really talk it through and process it so that she could get what she needed out of the conference without having to worry about absorbing new information that was going to throw her off and have her think about the whole thing in a different way. All of a sudden, when she was having this moment that she really needed to speak to the person who had hurt her. So those two things were really so valuable to me to learn when I was preparing for this case. We ended up bringing the two people together. It was like probably a 2-3, maybe 3-hour restorative justice conference. You know, a couple of the things that, you know, what happened, which was so interesting, was that she had expected the person to show up to be the person who caused this harm to her, who was aggressive and belittling and humiliating and harmful and violent. And what she found when the person showed up was that he was remorseful and felt terrible and kind of pitiful, right? He talked about his life. He talked about where he was, about how this had affected him. And it was like, it was kind of sad. And that she felt like kind of disappointed in that. And so at some point we took a break and we separated, and I was talking to her and she was like, I really just wanted to come and yell at him. I wanted to scream like, how dare you? And tell him like to get that smug face off of him, you know, and do all of these things. She wanted to scream and swear. And she's like, and I don't feel like I can right now because like, look at this guy, you know? And so I had talked to a social worker once who had told me about this empty chair strategy. And so I was like, well, let's just bring in a chair and let's pretend that this is the person who harmed you. Like that's the person. They're both the same person, but they're different parts. And she, and so she, you know, at first was really awkward. And then she started to talk to this empty chair and scream and shout and cry. And it was just like incredibly moving. I was in tears. It was like crazy. And then she calmed down. We came back together. The two of them negotiated an agreement that was like very specific about how they were going to talk about what happened to their friends that they had in common, how they were going to talk about this on social media. If they had any interaction, what was it going to be like? You know, they had very specific needs for safety and security for each of them, her in particular, that were listed, negotiated, written down, signed, and monitored for months and months after. And, you know, after this experience, it was like tough and emotional and difficult. And I checked in with both sides and they were very appreciative of being able to do it and of our help, but she in particular was still like really wrapped up and like felt a lot of emotions for some time. And, you know, it reminded me of what Tarek had said about like, this is going to be a point in the journey. It's not the end of the journey. And we talked about that. And I checked in with her probably every month for a few months and with the young man as well. And a few months in, I remember I was calling and, you know, she's like a young adult and is like busy and doesn't want to really talk to me and doesn't have time, but we were talking and she was like, hey, I just wanted you to know, you know, after the event happened for like almost a year before they got to the conference, she had to start seeing a therapist and get onto antidepressants. And she had told me about that. And she said, you know, I've stopped taking antidepressants and I've stopped seeing my therapist and I feel a lot better. And she also said, I never really told you, but I hadn't really been sleeping either. And I want you to know that, you know, I sleep fine now and I feel so much better. And so, you know, it speaks to what a lot of the panelists have talked about with trauma and healing from trauma and the ways in which restorative justice, as Nuri said, can be so much more healing and powerful for people, especially survivors, than, you know, our adversarial justice system, which offers so little. So, so that's one example of what restorative justice can look like in a justice system. And I will turn it back over to Dr. Coooper now.
Wow, everyone, I just want to, on our behalf, thank the panelists for starting, you know, this discussion tonight. We are looking forward to continuing it. Before I get to the questions, I almost want to do like a recap and an invitation for our panelists to come back on camera. Also, Senator Winfield, if you're welcome to come on camera, we would love to be able to ask you questions as well. But Lara, just thank you for starting off today's discussion. I just, with each panel, I said to myself, oh my God, all of this in one discussion. But thank you for highlighting aspects of the racial and ethnic disparities. Thank you for clarifying. We in the state of Connecticut had just had a landmark ruling from our, you know, Connecticut Supreme Court because of the harm of the term super predator and a young person being over sentenced here in our own state. And so you just highlighting, you know, that language matters, that the history of this work matters, I feel was all very powerful. Thank you, Alissa. It's crazy to have met some of you in person and the things that I'm learning about you right now on this call. I never knew that story about you and Dr. Levinson. And so it's just fascinating to see you from afar and even think I've seen you from up close. And now just thank you for the honesty that all of you brought to what you wanted to share in the conversation. I think you really highlighted Alissa, that restorative practices are not easy. And I think that's a great misconception. There's a lot of concern that the progressive reforms are about like hugging people, letting them go. There's a lot of worry about what accountability looks like. And so I really liked what you said, Nuri, that the restorative practice brings us to a primary attention on how do we have accountability to those survivor needs? How do we honor their choices, their time frame, their interests, their needs, all of that, taking that more into consideration and acknowledging that the current system, the criminal punishment system, wrote it down immediately, it was like, yes, why don't we all say that? Is just the opportunity for more options. There are different ways that we can go about this and provide satisfaction to persons who have been harmed. And then Seema, I kept saying to myself, it's not just your last webinar that I recognized you from. I was in the room when you spoke at Yale in 2019. And so I remember thinking how fascinating it was to continue to understand the wide array of professionals and to also, bring light to what the system can do with restorative justice. There's opportunity for pre-system, but for someone who represents system involvement, I was really compelled when you both today and back then acknowledged that if it goes down this road, there's still an accountability to survivors. There's still an opportunity to center and to reduce harm and to be more aware. And so I'm just going to kick off questions, and I'll have you all, if there's a direction, I'll direct it. But other than that, I'll just ask if any particular person wants to take the question on. So we have a question just like, asking, can you speak to experiences with children and restorative justice, with adults, but just not necessarily always about rape, but about any sort of sexual exposure? Is anyone willing to take that question? Everyone's willing to take that question. I see you, Seema. Thank you.
I'll just say because we are the juvenile prosecutor in Washington, D.C., we deal with young people who've caused harm and who are, in many cases, who are the victims of harm. And because a lot of crime happens, juvenile crime happens like towards other juveniles, right? So young people and young people. With respect to sexual harm, the first introduction into sexual harm that we had was prosecutors in our office. We weren't taking sexual harm cases, and prosecutors in our office came to us and said, we have all of these cases of kind of low-level sexual harm, which look like gropings over the clothes in schools, multiple, sometimes like a little bit more violent than others, and we are, being asked to prosecute these cases. People feel very strongly about them, but we don't really feel like it's appropriate to put these kids through the juvenile justice system. And so would you consider taking these cases? And so we spent a lot of time trying to learn about how to handle those kind of cases. We actually saw, I think, a video, Nuri, that you had done as part of our training regimen. And we started taking those cases, and we took many of them. And it was always so surprising to me, because inevitably what would happen is with young people, you have family members there, right? So you have parents, you have like maybe a mentor, other family members. And inevitably, when you would start having these conversations, it's like in a circle setting. Before COVID, at least, we were in person in a circle, and all of the questions, not all of the questions, but a lot of the questions are asked of everyone. And what would happen is there were a lot of moms and aunts and adult men who would be in the conference who would then start to talk about their own experience with sexual harm. And it would turn out that they like, and oftentimes the young women who were had been harmed, one of the reasons it was so harmful is because they'd had prior victimization of sexual harm. And it was so traumatizing to have this happen to them, because it was kind of ricocheting off of this past trauma. And I always used to feel that in almost all of those cases, the person who caused the harm was a boy. And it felt to me like such a powerful course correction. Like after walking out of those cases, I'd be like, those kids are never going to do anything like this again, right? We'd have conversations about consent and like sex and like using all the sex words and like make everybody uncomfortable. But the boys would be like, oh my God, like they had no idea. Nobody talks to them about sex and consent. They learn about it from like these older kids or music videos or I don't know where, porn. And so like they're so completely off base. And so to have these conversations and hear about people's personal experiences and what they need and what respect and consent looks like is super powerful for them. And I think corrective. And it is just like shocking that we would think that the juvenile justice system would be at all effective at correcting those things.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that question before I move us forward? No worries. The next question I'd like to bring us to is, as we know, in many instances, persons are mandated reporters. And the question is just, how does the duty to report affect the acceptance of restorative justice? Anyone want to comment on that? All right.
I mean, I'll just jump in just as like the lawyer thinking through it. You know, you have a duty to report and that's a legal duty that you have. And that then brings attention by the legal system to the problem, I guess, or the issue, the harm. What I would hope is that if there's a restorative program in place, that at that point, there could be the option to route the case to restorative justice. But I also defer, I mean, somebody like Seema seems like well poised to answer that question. I don't think that they're incompatible though.
Seema?
The duty to mandatory reporting, at least in Washington, D.C., it might be different in different places, is about, like it's typically not an issue if you're doing the work within a system because the case has already come about. It could become an issue if, for instance, you are speaking to a young person who is there to talk to you about a carjacking, and it turns out that they are the victim of abuse in their home that has been otherwise like not disclosed, then we would have a duty to report. So it's kind of like a separate situation in DC. All police officers, all teachers, like are mandatory reporters. So it doesn't really become an issue for us so much.
I could just also add, like from teaching classes in the past that focused on persons with problem sexual behaviors, it brings a lot of voluntary commentary of students' experiences themselves. And it was told to us very sternly as, you know, instructors that like, if you're receiving this information, you're supposed to pass this information forward. But then we were also kind of rebuffing them saying like, but they don't know that when they tell us that this is what we are then being forced to do. It really kind of made us as like an array of people teaching these types of classes say, how do we assert more fully so that people know when they're telling me that I have this legal duty? Because I think you acknowledged it really good in your presentation, Seema, like how do we reduce the surprises? Like if you telling me has now triggered a whole conversation and system, and you thought that you get to do something in private, and you thought that this was opening options and giving you control, and it's forcing me to do something on your behalf. That's one of the ways that I've experienced some of the problematic nature. Alissa?
Yeah, I would also add that when I am working with clients who have harmed, before we even engage a process, we are very upfront about our limits of confidentiality. So they know upfront what they can share that we can hold in confidence and what we can't. And so again, sort of just eliminating any surprises.
Alissa, I'm going to pass my next question to you, which is, do you feel it is important to use person first language rather than labels when talking about persons who have caused this type of harm?
Yes, full stop. Yes.
Full stop. I'll also just add that, like, not only is, to me, it important in a personal level, meaning I want to call people things that affirm them as opposed to tear them down, but even at an academic level, like, we've reached a point in the APA manual and other places where we're saying, like, it's just more clear, like, these labels are convoluting and they are causing harm and confusion as opposed to, like, clarity, which is the goal in our writing. So
Yeah, and I will add to that. When we label people with things that they might not consent to being labeled, we diminish their humanity and we diminish their dignity. And people are so much more than the worst thing they've ever done or the worst thing that's ever happened to them. So in my work, I use, person who has sexually harmed or person who has authored sexual harm and person who has experienced sexual harm. For myself, I use the term survivor, but that's a label that I choose to place on myself. But for others, I think person first language is really, really important.
thank you very much. I just want to ask, did I miss anyone else wanting to comment on that before I move us forward? No worries. My next question is for you, Lara. The person said, I know Nevada was mentioned at the start of the webinar. Do you know if this is only being done for juveniles in Nevada or adults as well?
My gosh, I'm definitely not a Nevada expert, so I defer
No
to anybody
worries.
who is. Yeah, I can't speak to any practices in Nevada. I defer to other members of the panel, though.
Let me ask a next question. The question is asking in general, has, I believe, restorative practices, it says this, has restorative practices been used with adolescents with sexual offenses? I think our answer is yes, but just wanted to get confirmation. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just really briefly, one thing that we do in the racial justice clinic at the University of San Francisco is we represent often teenagers who've been accused of sexual offenses in school. So these are school disciplinary proceedings. And so they're not in the criminal context. And recently we've been able to use restorative justice, turn to restorative justice as an alternative to, say, suspension or expulsion. And that we found in those cases, it's been a pretty effective alternative. So we've had some success with that. I don't want to say that I facilitate these. I have no training to be a facilitator, but as someone who's the advocate for the person who's been accused, I found that it tends to be a better outcome for everybody involved than going through the school's traditional disciplinary process.
For the next question, it says, is there data on outcomes, excluding recidivism, more focused on mental health, functioning in the community, et cetera, that you all can just speak a little bit more, like, is there research? I know some of you mentioned Dr. Koss. Is that the predominant resource or other things?
I can go ahead. There is quite a bit of research out there, not specific to sexual harms. And I can't think of any of the researchers off the top of my head, but all about mental health and well-being and satisfaction. All of that has been, the research is pretty clear on it. And I am happy to provide some of that literature. I just can't think of what it is off the top of my head, but yes, it exists. And yes, it finds that it has a profound impact on people who have authored harm in their understanding and in their well-being. So as I said, I'm happy to provide it. I just can't think of names off the top of my head.
I would also add that in the sister fields of emotional intelligence, social emotional learning, we have profound research on, like, when people can access their needs, their feelings about those needs, it does all the things that you all have described in terms of providing them, levels of therapeutic release. My next question for you all is, what can survivors do to promote restorative justice? Maybe I could pass this to you, Nuri.
So thoughtful. I mean, at first, I don't think it's their job to say that the system has to meet their needs, right? Like, I think that it is all of our jobs to say, why don't we center survivors? And why, when they ask for something different, do we tell them that we know better? So that's one thing. But I mean, I think that I don't know. I feel very hesitant to say that they should or can do anything, but I think there are many, maybe I'll frame it like this. There are many survivors who are saying what is happening doesn't meet their needs. And there are many survivors who are reaching out to folks like all of the people here to say, can I get my needs met in a different way? And then there's very public survivors who are speaking out about what in the current system silenced them and what they actually want in terms of their healing. And I think that it is our job to listen to them and to support them and having places to say that, but also not to just leave it there. Be like, oh, thanks for speaking about that. Great. It is our job to then create the thing that catches them, that meets those needs, right?
Thank you, Nuri. I would just add, I think you make a very great point that it's not their duty, right? They don't have an obligation, but I do want to point out the value when they do come to the table, right? Very high value. I've heard people say that this is not a process that serves or centers survivors or victims, and that instead it is just to alleviate, the potential punishments. And so the opportunity for persons who have benefited or persons who want these options to be available for others who have had similar experiences, I think those are also opportunities. Let me ask, someone mentioned that in one of our presentations, there was note of a reference to a validated survey instrument out of New Zealand. Do you know which? Yep. And is that something you might be able to point me to or share? So I don't know if you have something you could drop in the chat or that you want to say out loud that would help people access more about that information.
Sure. That was me. I can pull it up and put it in the chat. It might just take me a couple of minutes, but I'm happy to do that.
Nice. Perfect. Let me ask. My next question is, what are the risks of the restorative justice process when the person harmed are excluded by their own community as well as by the community of the perpetrators? I think we know our predominant goal is inclusion and voice of the survivor. But what are the risks? Is there any particular thoughts that anyone had that come to mind about how desire to participate might lead to ostracism even from one's own community? I saw leans and pauses, but that's okay.
I thought Alissa spoke to this pretty powerfully, like this idea that people expect you to have a certain kind of perspective if you've been victimized, and that if you don't share that perspective at times, I think people can really question, well, why aren't you more vengeful? Why don't you want this? Why don't you want that? And it's just unfortunate that there's that kind of judgment visited on people who've been harmed and traumatized, because you're just making it worse and you're sort of taking away their ability to experience what they experience in their own way. But I thought Alissa spoke to that really powerfully.
One of the questions from Quince in the Q&A is if there, it'd be wonderful if the panelists could talk about what they think would be the skill set and or any specific training for restorative justice facilitators who do not already have a sexual violence understanding or experience, who now want to begin facilitating restorative justice processes involving sexual harm. Would it make a difference if it is sexual harm between young people, meaning peer-to-peer sexual harm by or to youth, versus situations involving adults? Who would like to answer?
So I'm happy to speak to that. So in the training program that we have created at Ampersands, it is a training program specific to sexual harm. And so some of the things that we include there that I think are really important for people who are engaging this type of work is to understand the etiology of sexual harm. So why does it happen in the first place? To understand grooming techniques and justifications and excuses for sexually harmful behavior, to understand trauma responses, both so that they can talk to people who've experienced sexual harm about the specific types of trauma responses that they might experience both during the perpetration of the harm, but also long-term. And to teach that to people who have perpetrated sexual harm, because one of the things that we often see is that people who author sexual harm really do not understand that they are causing harm. And so having a foundation in trauma responses, the neurobiology of trauma, all of that is embedded in our training program. And again, you know, talking about grooming behavior, talking about cognitive distortions, we teach all of that. And really being somebody who, and I think this is less something that you can teach and more something that is innate, but having a calming presence where you're able to create a safe and sacred space for people to have these really difficult conversations and to be able to hold the kinds of trauma that people will be speaking to you about. So we talk about that in our training. I don't know that that's something that can really be taught. But... So I hope that answers the question, Quince.
Did anyone else want to respond before I move to our next question? Okay.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Wait, Danielle, can I add one thing about like young people? Yes, I think it's important that like on top of that, if you're working with young people, like if you have any like teenagers or young people in your life, it's different talking to them because they're at a different stage of development and they're at a different stage of sexual development. So I do think it's important that like the folks that work with young people actually know how to be with young people, like how to be with them and listen to them. And then also have done, and like, there's lots of places we can learn, but like also are learning about like, what are the sexual development stages and kind of where are folks at and where are they learning about sex, period. Like Seema said, I think that's like a huge question.
Thank you. My next question I'm going to ask is, in a previous webinar, Carl Hansen, when asked what type of sexual offense can most benefit from restorative justice, replied incest. Let me just ask if each of you might reply, do you agree, or any thoughts why or why not any particular offense might most benefit? I'm a poor circle runner this evening, I'm sorry. I'd like to pass to you, Nuri, that's okay.
I don't know if you see the same order I do, Danielle, but I'm like, I saw in my order, I'm right after you. So that makes sense. I wouldn't say most. Everyone is different. Every situation is different. What survivors need is different. How the person shows up that does the harm is different. And in my family, what my mom wanted was for the person that she loved and that loved her to understand that they were hurting her and to stop and to not do it again, right? And so I think that there is, let me say this, like to like maybe add a little nuance, is that when people have prior existing relationships and relationships where there is some like love there, it might be possible that there is more ability to get those folks into a room to have a dialogue. Might be, right? Or that the survivor in like, let's say my mom's case, could actually ask the person to show up, because sometimes that's what survivors want to do. So like that might be something that can happen that would be different than if the person is in less or no relationship.
Pass to you, Seema.
I would defer to Nuri. I don't have personal experience or experience in facilitation in this space at all.
Pass to
I think
you.
that's, I wholeheartedly agree with Nuri. I think what she said is very, very true.
Any additional thoughts from you, Alissa? Perfect. For our next question, I'm going to move to a few system type questions. So first, just based on where you are or what you know, how is restorative justice financed? Who's paying for these things? And how do we compensate the facilitators that you all are mentioning? And what has to happen financially before a restorative program can start?
I'll go first and then, pass it off. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind. People think like, oh, this is so expensive. This is prohibitively expensive. In California, it costs $81,000 to incarcerate someone for 1 year. And believe you me, it is cheaper to have a robust restorative program that's going to lower recidivism and make victims whole. It's not going to cost that much money. And so it's really just about priorities. You have to look at these industries that are saying we need the money, like the prison industrial complex, which is constantly saying that they need more funding to lock more and more people up for more and more money. And ask yourself, are those tax dollars being well spent, or could they be reallocated? And I feel like when we're talking about budgets, when we're going to our governors and advocating for certain programming, it's very, very important to point out that, first of all, mass incarceration perpetuates systemic racism and doesn't make people less safe. We need alternative approaches. And second, that restorative justice, far from being prohibitively expensive, is much, much more fiscally sound than the traditional carceral approach.
Would anyone like to add?
I would add that there are a lot of philanthropic organizations that are willing to fund restorative processes. So that's one of the ways that my organization seeks to do this work, is through grant funding to build educational programs around restorative justice. We're building one right now through a project in the Jewish community. So, building a restorative educational program based on the model that we use to bring to multiple organizations and then eventually to individuals who want these processes. And that's being funded by a larger organization. I will say that it is my personal practice to never, ever charge a survivor for this work, ever. So sometimes I will ask authors of harm to pay for the services, but always on a sliding scale, because it is more important to have the process and to provide the healing than it is to make extra money off of somebody who might not have it. So, when it's organizations, we charge for that work. But when it's individuals, it's much harder to ask for that. And I will never ask a survivor to pay.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to roll on because we've got so many questions. The next question is, do you have any examples of holding institutions accountable with restorative justice? The person who harmed me is one thing, but there's also an incredible betrayal by institutions enabling abuse. Would anyone like to speak to not just individual to individual justice, but systemic justice?
I'll jump in. I don't know that this is responsive, but one of the reasons it's really important for us when we hire restorative justice facilitators, who are all paid by the government here, the city council, it's important that we find people who are have the ability to build trust very quickly with people who are in communities that have experienced overcriminalization, typically the young people charged with the offense and their families, because there is, and so, we prioritize hiring people who come from the same communities, who have been justice involved themselves, because often part of these conversations, and this is not about sexual harm per se, but just general restorative justice conferencing around crime, a lot of time these conversations bleed into conversations about systemic racism and surveillance by law enforcement and the justice system and police officers and what they have done to family members and to them, to the young people themselves. And so, even in conversations with victims of crime, people who've been harmed in serious violent crime, those conversations actually come up more often than you would think. And it's important that the young people feel confident being able to share about that as they prepare for a restorative justice conference with the facilitator, and know that that person will kind of have a personal experience with that.
Thank you.
I can also add, oftentimes people who have been sexually harmed and then doubly harmed by institutional betrayal will say that the institutional betrayal was so much more harmful than the offense itself. And yes, that work is being done. I am involved in some of that work in the Jewish community holding institutions accountable for the harm that they cause. This is a very big thing in a lot of faith communities right now. And so, yes, that work is happening. Yes, that work is possible. It just looks a little different than, restorative processes for individuals to be face-to-face and in connection with one another.
For states that don't have restorative justice as an ongoing conversation, the question is, where should people start? Should they be seeking to get notice to the courts, to the DA's office, defender's office? Should they be, petitioning the legislator? Any advice for persons looking to start something in their own locale? I would also add to this question, one of the questions asked is it limited to, being brought to the police and the prosecutor? I don't think so. So then it's almost, Alissa, if I could ask you, how do persons get to you? Is that a private communication? Do people come and consult with you in that way?
Yes. So most of the cases that we facilitate at ampersands never go through a criminal legal process, right? I will work with DA's offices to build restorative programs, because if there are people who have been harmed who want that process, then I want it to be available through the state. But most of the clients that I serve don't want to go through a criminal process. They never want to report it in the first place. And so they are seeking alternatives to that. And so we just do this work in community. So one place to start is to look for people like Nuri, like myself, who do this work directly in the community.
Thank you. I see Nuri is also dropping resources in the chat. I am going to invite you all to just ask it. Would you like to give any final comments before I close us out today? I'll go to you first, Nuri. Any final thoughts for our audience?
The thing I did want to say is a lot of people focus on the process, right? Like, how do we do a process after harm has happened? But actually prevention is where we should be. So I'm going to share in the chat, the thing Alissa knows, I've been so inspired. There's this place called Project Dunkelfeld. I think it's called Prevent something now. But we need many people that have done sexual harm that I've worked with have said, I tried to go to rape crisis centers and tell them I had sexual harm thoughts, and they shut me down and said, we couldn't help you. And so people also need a place to go. So Project Dunkelfeld is this confidential thing where if you think you're going to do sexual harm, or if you might have, you can talk to somebody for free and they won't report you because you can get help and stop. So it's something I'm really big on. So I'm going to share it in the chat, but just that we need to make space for people to share the most shameful things and to get help when they do, right?
Thank you so much, Nuri. That's powerful. Any final thoughts from you, Seema?
I don't think I have anything like closure or inspiring. You guys have heard from such amazing people, so I don't think I can add to that. I did see in the chat, because I know Dr. Coooper, I don't know how you're managing to figure out what the questions are. There's so many questions. I did see a few questions about confidentiality, and I'll just say that at our office in Washington, D.C., we are the prosecutor, and we crafted a confidentiality policy that binds us as prosecutors from never using any statements that were made by participants during the entire restorative justice process, that those statements will be protected, won't be shared with any prosecutor or anybody else, can't be used against them at trial. There are a couple of exceptions, and as Dr. Ackerman said, the mandatory reporting is one exception. Also, there are a couple of small exceptions, one of which is for research, de-identified information. So we have a confidentiality policy that's very robust and protective, and the purpose of it obviously is to make sure that people can feel safe sharing and speaking authentically and honestly, and folks seem to understand that.
Can you comment quickly, Seema, is the work happening in DC in the prosecutor's office? Are there other replications of that in the United States, or are there other states or municipalities doing the work you're doing?
Yeah, there are many counties and cities that have district attorneys that have partnerships with community-based organizations that perform restorative justice for cases that they refer to them. Most of those are for juvenile crime. The organization Impact Justice out of Oakland has been providing technical assistance and training to build those programs, to build relationships with DAs and nonprofits for long before we were doing our work. And there are some DA's office. I mean, we get calls all the time. We get calls all the time from prosecutors' offices seeking to want to build restorative justice for their victims of crime and their people charged with crime.
Thank you. Alissa? No, I see Lara is here. Lara, it's you.
Hi, I have to jump off because my children are here, but I just want to thank everyone. And Seema, I am going to incorporate everything that you're doing. And Alissa, I'm going to incorporate what you're doing and Nuri into my PowerPoint so that it's more comprehensive next time. Thank you so much, Dr. Coooper, for facilitating. And I just feel like I always learn so much and ton of admiration and appreciation. So thank you, Cindy, for putting this together. And I hope we all see each other soon. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Lara. Alissa?
I just want to say what an honor it is to be surrounded by such powerful, wonderful, inspiring people. And I just thank everybody for being here. And Cindy, thank you for putting this on. It's an absolute honor.
Yes, thank you, Cindy. And we'll turn to you for our closing.
Oh, thank you. I really wasn't going to speak, but since Senator Winfield had to retire, if you can call it that, with his 3-year-olds, you know, if you ever get a chance to listen to Marley Liss's story, I had to replay it about 3 or 4 or 5 times one day because we were capturing certain segments or, you know, certain messages from it. And so what I heard her say is that, and it just all of a sudden inspired me, is that she saw the justice system as she had a choice. She had a choice between the traditional legal system, what I call the criminal justice system, or in Canada, she had a petition for it. But as a victim, they have a victim rights in their constitution. She was able to petition the court and be granted restorative justice. And so I thought about that for a while. And, you know, because I'm a human advocate and I'm not a cheerleader for sexual crime, but I am supportive of restoration and redemption and forgiveness, you know, when necessary to people who do harm. But what it reminded me of is that I get picked on a lot in my state for, we talk about or hear underreporting or re-victimization. And I thought, if someone chooses not to report, I should honor that. I shouldn't attack the system, because unless we're able to change the legal system harms for all the reasons we talked about tonight. And then, of course, you know, there's restorative justice without a legal intervention versus prosecutor-fed cases. So I just wanted to turn that around a little, because it's very upsetting to have these special stakeholders come out at a group that has done harm, but has also paid the debt to society. And we're all trying to heal. And then I wanted, Nuri, based on what you were saying about the helplines, Stop It Now just started a new one, mostly for children and adolescents, young adults. Same thing. So if you're thinking about something or you're confused about anything, gender identity, sexual orientation, I might want to do harm, or I'm getting bullied because of, there's a helpline. And is it oh, the woman from Canada, never Heisman. I can't remember her first name now. Angela Heisman, maybe. The Canada has a new helpline as well. And so we're recognizing, just like Europe, that if people have a place to go, you know, we can reduce sexual harm, but we all need safe spaces. Thank you all to everyone. I same time next year, right?
We thank everyone. You are OSJ. We thank them on behalf of OSJ for being here. Thank you to our panelists. I just want to say, the nerd in me, the scholar in me, I will definitely be using this because the layers of conversation that we had, I think really help address a lot of the myths of the power of both centering survivors and using restorative practices to do so. Thank you all.